Europe is no place to start a business, or so we're told by entrepreneurs and business leaders across the world. Bureaucracy, high taxes, difficulty in hiring people all make Europe a challenging place to start and grow a business compared to the United States or even China. And if we look at the age of Europe's largest companies, Europe hasn't given birth to any in the past 50 years, save ASML, which was a spin-off from another European giant. On the surface, it seems that European countries and Europeans themselves are lacking an entrepreneurial backbone or culture. Talking from experience as a small business owner myself running into Europe, I wanted to understand the main barriers to Europeans starting and scaling their own businesses, and find out if what they say about European entrepreneurship is actually true. I looked into business demographic data, tax policy, and the setup of Europe's financial system to understand the main barriers businesses face when starting and scaling, all to understand why starting a business in Europe is like playing life on hard mode, and to find out what we might be able to do to make more European businesses emerge. So why is starting a business in Europe so hard? Europe needs new and better businesses to tackle two main problems. First, European businesses are smaller, less digitalized, and competitive than their peers across the world. And second, because Europe is struggling to develop new industries and reap the rewards in the form of economic growth and well-paying jobs that come with them. But the problem is that Europe isn't starting new businesses. I actually found this pretty cool data set with a bunch of business demographic data from the OECD, which allows us to take a look into the births and deaths of businesses across the European Union. When we look at businesses founded, the trend is quite clear. In sectors like industry, science and tech, or logistics, Europeans are founding fewer businesses than before, while the European hospitality sector is still growing. Let's focus on industry for a second. While the decline is true for most European countries, it has been particularly sharp in France, the Netherlands, Spain, Italy, and the Czech Republic, while Poland stands out with a much higher level of businesses being born. This is in part due to demographics. As Europe ages, there are fewer men aged between 30 and 50 who are the likeliest to start businesses. Since about 2006, the share of working population across Europe started to fall, and with it, the amount of potential entrepreneurs. But this fall has been on a similar scale to that of the United States, which itself still has more entrepreneurs. In this study with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, the OECD estimates that European countries are missing far more entrepreneurs than similarly aged societies. And this is despite the fact that Europeans are at least stating that they want to start businesses on a similar level to that of other countries. By the way, we really have to hand it to Poland here, who don't seem like they're particularly entrepreneurial based off of intention. But this contradicts the data we just saw on starting businesses. So to the Poles, you guys don't talk, you simply go and do. So congrats for that. But generally speaking, Europeans are starting fewer businesses, and new European businesses aren't surviving as much. The survival rate of European businesses has fallen over the past decade, and they're less likely to make it into their fifth year. This is particularly true for science and technology companies, with the Netherlands being a rare European exception which managed to raise it, and Sweden which managed to keep it at a high level. Industrial companies managed to keep it mostly together up until at least 2022 when this dataset ends. This doesn't really allow us to look at what happened after the coronavirus pandemic and the energy crisis, which damaged many European businesses. Yet if we read a couple of news headlines about the economic climate and business closures, we can reasonably fill in the dots. The trend of European businesses in many countries having a hard time is still ongoing. But if you decide to go against the trend and start a business, then today's sponsor, Odoo, might be something for you. Odoo is the all-in-one online business platform that helps you manage your whole business from accounting to project management, website creation, and more. I needed a brand new website for Into Europe to share my scripts and sources all in one place, and I discovered Odoo. I found their website editor pretty intuitive, having all the functionalities I needed to create Into Europe's digital front end, aside from my face and the YouTube channel. I didn't need any technical skills. It's easy. You can simply drag and drop blocks and customize them by adding content like images, text, video, or documents. You can try animations and shapes and colors to make it pop, and if you're really feeling stuck, you can let ChatGPT spark your creativity with fresh ideas or text. Thanks to my new Odoo website, all my sources and scripts are in one place, for free. Because the first Odoo application is free for life, including unlimited support and hosting. They even offer a custom domain name for 1 year just to get you started. So if you want to build or reinforce your online presence, go make your own website with Odoo and get started on your business goals today. Now, back to the video. So why then is starting a business so difficult in Europe? While culture plays a role that can't be understated, European institutions and regulations have worsened an already hostile environment for the growth of new businesses. After following up on the main literature and doing a bunch of research, there are 5 main reasons why Europe is not as business-friendly as the United States. First, due to Europe's welfare states, there is simply less of an incentive to start a business. Second, when they are started, European businesses have fewer consumers, have a hard time hiring employees, finding investors, and finally they're faced with more regulation and bureaucracy. So let's first start by looking at how the welfare state reduces incentive to be an entrepreneur. While most countries across the world have some form of welfare state, European countries have taken it the furthest. They have some of the highest levels of public spending out of any place in the world, but also cheap subsidized higher education, a social safety net for the sick and unemployed, universal health care, and pensions. As a result, government spending as a share of GDP increased dramatically after World War II and then once again in the 1970s. And it's now taking up once again, mainly driven by pension and healthcare spending as a result of Europe's aging societies, something I covered in a previous video. But all of this social spending comes at a cost in the form of higher taxes and actually reduces the incentives to be an entrepreneur. It's relatively comfortable being an employee in a welfare state, and in most European countries, you don't have much to fear from losing your job. Swedish economist Magnus Henriksson, who has studied the link between entrepreneurship and the welfare state for decades, points out that entrepreneurship out of necessity doesn't really happen in Europe. I mean, you don't really need to start a hustle if the government will take care of you and provide you with the basic necessities in case you lose your job. You could argue this is ethical and avoids people being on the street if they don't have a job. But it also discourages people that are intrinsically motivated from starting their own business. As a self-employed person, I have to take care of my own pension, my own medical coverage, have no unemployment benefits, and if I stop producing videos because I get sick, as has happened several times this past year, then I don't get paid. If you're American, you might be like, what is this guy complaining about? That's what we do here. And you'd be right, but I'm comparing myself to European employees here. Employees accumulate pension rights, have generous sick leave, and are hard to fire. And when they are, they tend to get extensive severance packages and receive unemployment benefits which accumulate with years worked. In some European countries, you can get benefits related to unemployment for up to 5 years after you lose your job. In other words, as a self-employed person running a small business, you don't benefit nearly as much from the social protections and comforts offered by the welfare state. And if you're working for a company, then your relative safety might make you think twice before quitting to start something yourself. But if you manage to pass that first hurdle and actually start your own business, then you have to deal with the fact that European businesses have access to fewer and poorer consumers. Europeans are simply not as good as consumers as Americans. On average, Europeans work about 30% fewer hours and earn less money. And while that doesn't mean anything for happiness, with Europeans being generally more content with their lives than Americans and dominating happiness rankings, it does matter for a business trying to sell you goods and services. Europeans eat less food, buy smaller cars and homes, fill them with fewer things, and they keep their phones for longer. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the economy needed to provide those things is also smaller. And those consumers are siloed off into different language and regulatory markets, which reduces the opportunity for European businesses. A Polish marketing firm can't really reach out to a client in France, or it would have to pay an expensive price to reach out, while one in New York could potentially service the whole of the United States. It's actually more complicated delivering a service across the borders of the European Union because of different laws. Some services in particular are virtually exempt from the single market, such as energy, telecommunication, and transportation, meaning that starting or expanding cross-border businesses is nearly impossible. Doctolib, a French tech darling providing digital services for healthcare providers, has taken more than 8 years to start gaining traction in the German market because of how bureaucratic and fragmented it is. As a fun anecdote, it's actually easier for me to have a sponsor from the United States than it is one from the European Union, because member states want to know where to assign VAT so that they can get their tax money, which is something I have to do in my quarterly tax declarations. And even if you manage to find enough consumers to satisfy your business, you're going to struggle scaling it by hiring workers. One of the main ways the welfare state is financed is through taxes on work. 2/3 of your income in a European country like Belgium is taxed away, either in the form of income taxation or employer contribution. The only European countries that come close to being in line with the United States when it comes to taxing labor are the UK, Denmark, and Poland, with about 40% tax on labor, and Switzerland at 28%. If I wanted to hire someone in-house to produce videos, I would not only have to take on the risk of having someone on my payroll, I would also have to pay an extra in the form of taxes. This creates what economists call a tax wedge, where the cost of hiring a worker is split from the actual income he or she receives because of taxes. The higher the taxes, the bigger the wedge. This is not only a problem for employees whose income is reduced and might look for opportunity elsewhere, it also raises the cost of hiring people for companies. While larger and more established companies can afford this, it can be prohibitive for smaller businesses to attempt to scale because of the sheer cost of hiring that first employee. And European tax wedges are far higher than in the rest of the world. And due to the progressive income tax, this puts an even bigger cost on high-skilled labor, making it harder to hire and contributing to the huge salary disparity between Europe and the United States for skilled workers like software engineers. In Sweden, by its peak in 1979, this tax on labor had reached 91%, before falling back to 75% in the late 90s and 67% in 2017. This high tax burden poses another problem. Europe simply doesn't have enough money for investment. Higher tax rates on work together with lower working hours in most European countries means people can't save money as much, either to start their own business or to invest in other businesses. And most Europeans have their wealth locked up in real estate. In most European countries, more than 60% of household wealth was in housing. In the US, it was less than 40%. To top this off, intergenerational solidarity in the form of pay-as-you-go pension systems, where current workers pay for retirees, increases taxes and decreases savings in most European countries. Instead of depositing money in pension and venture capitalist funds that can invest in the economy, most Europeans pay taxes in exchange for the promise of pensions. While some European countries like Ireland, the Scandinavians, the Netherlands, and the UK have diversified, pension assets in 4 of the 5 major European economies, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, were below 10%. In the US, they were at 132%. Not only does this decrease the amount of money in the economy right now, it also means that for most European countries, there is no magical pot of money from which to invest in businesses. And when we look at the way European money is invested, we can see that it's far from optimal. Europeans have smaller financial savings than Americans, and what smaller savings they do have were far less likely to be invested in equity, stocks, or shares. In other words, in businesses. As Swedish economist Magnus Hagninson, alongside Nicholas Ellert and Mark Sanders, point out, this is because national tax systems in Europe favor debt finance. Because capital gains and dividends are taxed while interest payments are tax deductible, it makes it cheaper for companies to raise funds through debt rather than through equity. As such, debt finance channels society's available savings into the reproduction and growth of the existing capital stock. This is a question of generalized risk aversion. As Henriksen continues, European governments have been more interested in preserving their tax bases by keeping the money flowing to established companies rather than new riskier businesses. When it comes to ordinary people, the study by the European Central Bank found that as their wealth increased, people were more willing to take risks, but that Europeans overall were much less likely to own risky assets regardless of income level compared to Americans. Instead, Europeans kept most of their savings in banks, which play the role of top investors in the continent. As a result, that means that European businesses are more dependent on financing through the banking system, which is itself also risk-averse, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, which saw lending to companies collapse in the European Union, in part due to stricter rules around lending. In other words, most European funding in the EU goes to existing companies who can get advantageous loans, as opposed to new ones which are considered too risky. And that very same source of funding, through debt, has stagnated over the past decade. Finally, the EU prides itself on its regulation, and the EU has been called the world's regulatory superpower by its admirers and critics. Most EU advocates claim that this protects consumers from corporate abuse, and while that may be true with the EU having some of the best quality food in the world and some of the strictest pollution or data protection rules, the flip side is that the EU is unfriendly to businesses. This specific study found that the GDPR, the EU's data protection regulation, decreased the number of deals involving EU ventures with data-related businesses activities by almost 31%. In fact, the EU itself is aware of the consequences of some of its policies on European businesses, which is why it tries to exclude SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, from cumbersome legislation, like reporting on corporate sustainability. The EU looked to exclude those small businesses, but that hasn't helped the SMEs. According to Eurochambers, the European Chamber of Commerce, requirements of the EU on banks and larger corporations to prove that they're working on green projects end up being requirements on the businesses that they're lending or subcontracting to. In other words, through what I'm going to call trickle-down regulation, rules that are meant to target large companies end up targeting almost everyone else, and increasing bureaucratic burden for European companies. And the thing is, all these challenges disproportionately affect new businesses. Managing paperwork from regulation, affording employees whose costs are inflated by labor taxes, getting equity funding or a loan from a bank is simply more difficult in Europe, and even more so if you're a smaller business. There are some other national policies that I came across when looking into this topic that deserve some special mention for how damaging they are to national businesses. Being in the Olympic mood, I decided to give out some medals based off of how infuriating they actually are. First, our bronze medal goes to an unexpected challenger, the Netherlands. The country's sick leave policy has businesses pay out at least 70% of an employee's sick leave for up to 2 years. While this is affordable for a larger business, if your business is small, this burden is a potential death sentence. The silver medal goes to Spain, which has some of the most expensive contribution for self-employed people at nearly 300 euros a month that has to be paid before any profits. This is a country where the median income is 1,800 euros a month for a single person. And finally, our gold medal goes to Italy, where, I kid you not, businesses have to pay their taxes ahead of time based off of future projections. Okay, so we get it. Starting a business in Europe is tough. But if Europe is so terrible for starting new businesses, then what is happening to all of Europe's entrepreneurial talent? Well, I actually covered part of that in a previous video on Europe's brain drain to the United States, which can be complemented by the internal brain drain of the European Union, where Southern and Central and Eastern Europeans actually end up moving to the relatively more business-friendly Northern Europe. But according to this report by the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, part of Europe's entrepreneurs go on to succeed inside established companies. Scandinavian, British, Irish, and Dutch firms, for example, are quite successful at internal innovation and have high levels of entrepreneurial employees. While that's great news for the competitiveness of established companies, and it can potentially lead to corporate spin-offs like all of the Philips-related companies in the Netherlands, and might explain why European planes are not falling out of the sky, it generally means that it's harder to create new groundbreaking industries. After all, if all of your entrepreneurial talent ends up at existing firms, you're less likely to develop new groundbreaking fields. So what might European countries and the European Union be able to do about the challenges facing its businesses? Well, Europe and the European Union are aware of their entrepreneurial shortcomings, which is why we routinely have ex-Italian prime ministers writing reports about European competitiveness and entrepreneurship. While they make some fair points, it's quite ironic considering that Italy, by many of the metrics considered in this video, is the least entrepreneurial country in Europe. But if we pass on the irony for a second, we can take a look at what European countries and the European Union are doing to make life easier for businesses. Taxes on income have somewhat fallen since the 2000s, making it easier to hire workers, but they remain still far higher than the rest of the world. Reforms to private pension funds in some European countries have led to small pots of gold for investment appearing. Other European countries are trying to make up for the shortfall in investment with government institutions. The French and British investment banks are looking to invest money into companies and finance riskier investments. The EU's plan for a capital markets union plans to unite the continent and make it easier for cross-border investment, and to make sure that European companies don't need to rely on American investment for funding above 50 million euros. While these measures are great, there is no replacement for an entire society of investors with deeper pockets and more willingness to take on risk, like that of the US. In one of the Italian reports, Enrico Letta talks about completing the single market and calls for an EU commissioner to slash administrative burdens. In fact, the French, German, and Italian economy ministers in April announced that they wanted to pass an omnibus law to cut regulation and bureaucracy at the EU level. But I think we can be quite pessimistic about this, because previous calls to cut the red tape, which was already one of the sticking points back into the lead-up of the Brexit vote, hadn't really materialized into anything real. And to be fair, the EU doesn't really have a great track record on cutting back bureaucracy, and neither do most European national governments. But what are some other steps that we can take to fix some of Europe's other problems, like that of incentives? Well, the most radical way might be to scrap the welfare state entirely and go for the American model, which is something we probably don't want to do or aren't willing to do. So might there be a way we could tweak the welfare state in such a way to address some of the main problems we talked about in this video? Well, luckily for us, this is a question that Swedish economist Magnus Henriksson and his colleagues attempted to answer in their book, The Entrepreneurial Society, a reform strategy for the European Union, with many of the proposals looking into how to tackle problems faced by entrepreneurs. I selected a few that I found interesting and that relate to the points I previously mentioned in this video, but if you want the full picture, I recommend you read the full book, or at least look at the list of proposals. The first is by removing the opportunity cost of entrepreneurship and improving flexibility in the labor market. This goes by guaranteeing equal access to the welfare state regardless of tenure in a specific job or labor market status. This would accompany a move that would allow firms to hire and fire people more easily, while at the same time guaranteeing a lower impact on people losing their jobs. Measures like this would avoid someone like me missing out on building up a pension, though it could open the door for abuse and might lead to people pursuing less productive activities, like producing videos on the internet, or simply not working at all. Then we could increase funding for businesses. The first way to do this is by allowing more wealth accumulation and lowering the threshold to invest by lowering capital gains and dividend taxes. This would push more investments to equity, which could benefit smaller businesses as opposed to debt. A further push could come from encouraging banks to increase their investment into European companies by increasing the mandatory equity ratio in banking from 10 to 15%. And it could also benefit employees by exempting the stock options they sometimes receive from income tax. While some of these things sound rather straightforward, others might sound a bit lopsided and either very economically liberal or very economically progressive. And I would agree. Unconditional money and welfare is ripe for abuse, and it's the reason why it's so often tied to employment. And tax cuts all around to make Europe a competitive place to do business is likely to be expensive and met with protests around wealth inequality. As Henriksen puts it in one of his earlier papers, the institutions of the welfare state have little in common with those that promote entrepreneurship. And it only makes sense that any attempt to reconcile the two would be a convoluted and expensive mess. But the cost of not having any new businesses is one that a society can't bear in the long run. Lower growth, lower productivity, and no new industries. But what do you think? Should Europe adopt a more American model? Should it tweak the welfare state as much as possible in order to fix its problems with having new businesses? Or should it try to push market integration further before looking into reforms for the welfare state? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you like this video on the challenges facing European entrepreneurship and starting businesses, then I invite you to watch this video on Europe's brain drain to the United States. Or if you want to know more about how difficult it is for young people, then I invite you to watch this video on Europe's challenges for young people. And finally, don't forget to check out this video's sponsor, Odoo, and try their convenient and affordable all-in-one solution to build a website and a business.